Welcome to the keynote lecture, When a Country Does Not Love You Back, delivered by Professor Gloria Wekker at the NIAS Conference on Studies of Belonging. Thank you all for joining this special evening. It's Wednesday, 9 June, a little bit past 7:30 p.m. in Amsterdam. My name is Zara Kars, I am program maker at NIAS, and I will be your moderator tonight. I am speaking to you live from Amsterdam, and I am about to introduce my wonderful guests, Gloria Wekker and Jan-Willem Duivendak, and later Bob Schons, who will each address an exciting, important, and sometimes difficult topic, belonging. How, what, and with whom should we look at belonging, exploring it as a field of study? And why is it important to look at it from an interdisciplinary angle? Before I tell you more about tonight's program and our speakers, let me briefly tell you what NIAS is, and for those of you not in the know, what the NIAS Conference on Studies of Belonging is about. So NIAS is the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences. It is an interdisciplinary research institute where scholars, artists, journalists, and writers from all over the world work on individual research projects and engage in collective learning. This is a very special year for NIAS because we celebrate our 50th anniversary. Part of our celebrations is organizing this conference on studies of belonging. And tonight's keynote by Gloria Wekker is part of a collection of more than 40 panels, arts presentations, and 3 keynotes, during which we will map the field of studies of belonging together with scholars, artists, and everyone else interested in exploring this relatively under-investigated field of artistic and academic study. For those of you interested in joining the conference next to attending this keynote, registration is still open. Just go to www.niasconference.nl and register for upcoming conference days. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers tonight. We will kick off this evening with a lecture by Gloria Wekker. Wekker is an Afro-Surinamese Dutch cultural anthropologist with specializations in gender studies, sexuality, African American and Caribbean studies. She is Emerita Professor in Gender Studies at Utrecht University and a NIAS alumna. Among her noteworthy publications are The Politics of Passion, Women's Sexual Culture in the Afro-Surinamese Diaspora, for which she received the Ruth Benedict Prize of American Anthropological Association, and, of course, White Innocence, Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race, of which I just heard the 6th edition was just published. In 2017, she was distinguished as one of the 10 most influential academics in the Netherlands. And between 2019 to 2021, she holds the King Willem-Alexander Chair for Lowland Studies at the University of Liège, Belgium. That's fantastic. So drawing on her experiences when she felt she did or did not belong, Wekker tonight critically reflects on the theme of belonging, and she will formulate some starting points and questions for this upcoming field of study. Following Gloria's lecture is a response by Jan-Willem Duivendak, NIAS Director and Professor of Sociology at the University of Amsterdam. His research interest includes belonging, new social movements, the changing welfare state, and nativism. He has published numerous articles and books, including The Politics of Home, Crafting Citizenship, and The Culturalization of Citizenship, Belonging, and Polarization in a Globalizing World. Duivendak will respond to Gloria's presentation, highlighting some issues he's convinced are pertinent to discuss today. After their presentations, Bob Schons, who is a writer, poet, and columnist, will read 2 poems for us. She's a driving force behind many spoken word initiatives in the Netherlands, and she hosts, among others, Bab's Woordsalon, a show that has brought her to many large podia, including Lowlands and Oerol Festival, which are well known here in the Netherlands. And in 2018, Bab Schons won the Black Achievement Award for Arts and Culture in the Netherlands. So it's great that she will be joining us. After Bab Schons' performance, we are opening up the discussion and we invite you, our audience, to engage in the conversation. So really, don't be shy and raise your questions in the chat or Q&A. And I will make sure that your questions get to Jan Willem and Gloria. So for you, audience, consider the floor yours, because we are very curious what you think. And now I think it is time to move to our keynote speaker. So Gloria, can I give you the floor?
Thank you, Sarah, for these introductions. Dear audience, dear organizers, it is my great pleasure and honor to be addressing you today at NIAS's 50th conference, or 50th anniversary conference on belonging. I look with pleasure at the year I spent at this institute in 2011-2012, the productive atmosphere, the wonderful discussions and meals we had together. It's a beautiful location, which was then in Wassenaar, in the middle of the woods. I started working on what later would become my book, White Innocence. Can I have the next slide? Yes, please. Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race. And at the end of the year, I had actually written a book proposal to Duke University Press and chapter 1. I had been thinking about the Netherlands and race/ethnicity ever since I had come back from LA in 1992. And I had lectured and given talks and classes on these issues. But it was a real gift to get this sabbatical and to finally have the time and the space to think and write. White Innocence is forever connected to NIAS for me. I also want to say thank you on behalf of my late brother Herman, who was a professor of linguistics at the University of Groningen, who also had a sabbatical here. His daughter, my wonderful niece Fanneke, keeps the connection going as the director of academic affairs. So there are many ongoing ties. Let me say briefly something about my title, When a Country Doesn't Love You Back. In August 2020, the summer of Black Lives Matter, I was struck by a statement by Doc Rogers, the coach of the US basketball team, the LA Clippers. I always watch their results if I get a chance, because I lived in LA for so long. This Doc Rogers made his statement after the murder of Jacob Blake, one of the next victims after George Floyd, killed by the police. This is what he says. It's just so sad. What stands out to me is just watching the Republican convention, viewing this fear. All you hear is Donald Trump and all of them talking about fear. We're the ones getting killed. We're the ones getting shot. We've been hung. We've been shot. It's amazing why we keep loving this country, and this country doesn't love us back. His words struck me because they precisely and painfully summed up how I have often come to feel about the Netherlands. Difficult as that may seem to believe for many of you, I have written White Innocence as an act of love and affect, and out of a sense of justice towards the Netherlands. I want us to be the best we can be. And you'll notice that I inscribe myself in the Dutch nation, we. I want this to be a country that is truly and radically egalitarian, and where, as a recent report by the Erasmus University, Rotterdam, shows, inequality does not already start in the womb. I am not arguing that the racial contract, that is the written and unwritten rules of how whites should interact with blacks in the US, look exactly like that in the Netherlands. But I am arguing that formerly imperial states have formed a cultural archive. Can I have the next slide? What comes with a cultural archive, as Edward Said says, the next one, we can imagine the cultural archive as a storehouse in which a certain knowledge, structures of attitude and reference, and in Raymond Williams's words, structures of affect, have been deposited, which assign superiority and the right to dominate others to whites and inferiority to blacks. To further set the tone for my presentation tonight, highlighting the main route I will be traveling, let me start with one of my favorite quotes in White Innocence, which I learned from Toni Morrison, which you see here, the Nobel Prize winner for literature, when she says in her essay, Home, "I have never lived, nor have any of us, in a world in which race did not matter. Such a world, free of racial hierarchy, is usually imagined or described as dreamscape, Edenesque, utopian. So remote are the possibilities of its achievement." And this is the key part of the quote: how to be both free and situated, how to convert a racist house into a race-specific yet non-racist home, how to enunciate race while depriving it of its lethal cling. With this quote, she offers us a program that we need to strive for if we want to be a non-racist society. That is to say, not to be colorblind, nor, of course, racist, but to be race cognizant. That is to say, we have to understand that race and races do not exist. There's only one race, that is the human race. While race doesn't exist, racism does. And we have to do away with the toxic baggage that race saddled us with. That is to say that whiteness got adorned with all kinds of privileges and superiority, while black people and people of color have had to deal with the systemic features of ascribed inferiority. I understand race as a silent but powerful organizer of our culture, of our self-representations and the representation of the other, of our language and institutions, and of society as a whole. That I begin my presentation on belonging with a quote on race tells you exactly what my approach into this territory is going to be. In the starkest terms, it means that belonging, in my mind, is refracted through race and gender and sexuality and class. That it is absolutely vital to recognize that we do not occupy the same positions in society, that some people are privileged and others are set back. This will be my central argument. We cannot get to any meaningful understandings of belonging if we remain colorblind and if we do not think intersectionally and decolonially. What will I do today? The structure of my presentation will be the following. I will first offer you a reading of belonging, how it has been studied in the initial stages of a variety of disciplines. And then I will look at its latest incarnations, which become increasingly interesting to me as in the last decades, let's say since the 50s of the last century, people of color have started to also speak on belonging. I then move in the second part to an empirical and analytical section where I investigate what belonging has looked like for me as one of the very few Black female professors in the Netherlands. For someone in my position, it has had to become second nature to gauge in what environment I find myself. Do I belong, or am I perennially one of them, a space invader, standing out like a sore thumb? Finally, in my conclusions, I will succinctly address the how, what, and with whom of mapping belonging. This is quite a program. It's been a task to get all of it in, and I haven't been able to do that. But I hope that we will continue to have these conversations because I think they are important. Okay, next slide. A genealogical reading of belonging. Belonging is about emotional attachment.
Recording in progress.
About feeling at home, about feeling safe. It has been studied in classical sociology, psychology, social psychology, and pedagogy. One may even consider the theme of belonging as foundational to these disciplines, with their concerns, for instance, in sociology, what happens when older forms of belonging are displaced by industrialization, for instance. The book by Ferdinand Tönnies, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. In social psychology, much attention has been given to individuals' needs to conform to the groups they belong to, out of fear of exclusion. I also want to mention the masterful study Stigma by Irving Goffman about the social mechanisms that come into play when an individual incurs an undesirable label like becoming a criminal or having a mental health problem or being a member of a racial or religious minority. When we look at pedagogy, there has been a lot written, of course, about the fear of separation from the mother in infants and children. I cannot possibly do justice to the richness of the work under the rubric of belonging, but I will convey some of my key understandings in this field, which may be useful to NIAS. The moment when the study of belonging becomes especially interesting to me is when scholars of color start to reflect on it. Next slide. In the later decades of the 20th century, someone like Stuart Hall, director of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham, a Jamaican-born immigrant to the UK, whose life work centers on how we can live together with difference, living with and undoing the color line in the 21st century. His work is highly interdisciplinary, including sociology, Marxism, representation and discourse theory, and film studies. His prolific work on race, ethnicity, and nation, which are the three cornerstones of his work, has been summed up by Henry Louis Gates Jr. as the attempt to feel at home in the UK without becoming like the majority culture. I want to especially mention his essay, by no means the only one that is of import. New Ethnicities is from 1988. It has been a groundbreaking work. In it, he showed how immigrants to the UK from the Caribbean and Asia, with very different backgrounds, cultures, histories, and languages, in an unprecedented move, started to call themselves Black at the end of the 70s and during the 80s. In this move, they were accomplishing three things at once. First, they were transforming a thus far pejorative term into an affirmative, solidarity-based term of pride. Second, in the process, they were blowing up the biological basis of race and substituting a cultural understanding of who they were. And third, they were claiming entirely new terms of how they wanted to belong to the UK, like Black Brits, and not as the undesirable non-subjects like they had thus far been treated. A similar development took place in the Netherlands, by the way, especially in the women's movement in the 70s and 80s, also inspired by developments in the UK where Indo-Moluccan, Surinamese, Antillean, Moroccan and Turkish women started calling ourselves Black. What I take from Hall's outstanding work is that it is important to look at belonging interdisciplinarily, kaleidoscopically, aware of existing power relationships, and to consistently be asking who the implicit subject of belonging is. I will just, for brevity's sake and to honor my time limits, mention two people that I think are really important. One is Naira Yuval Davis, also from the UK, who does work that is intersectional, it's theoretical as well as empirical. She's also an immigrant into the UK from Israel. And for the Netherlands, I think the work of Bruno Jones is important, where he shows meticulously studying the debates that take place in Parliament and within successive governments about the arrival of different groups upon their entry in the Netherlands. The discursive power that the state has brought to bear in constructing these groups as not belonging, as basically not fit to function in modern Dutch society, is really noteworthy in his work. Okay, we move on to the second part that is about being a space invader and belonging. Can I have the next slide? So in this part, I will share some parts of my academic trajectory with you. That is to say that I will be reflecting autoethnographically on my life in the academy from the time I was a student at the University of Amsterdam. Autoethnography is a form of qualitative research in which an author uses self-reflection and writing and experience to explore her experience and connect this autobiographical story to wider cultural, political, and social meanings and understandings. In other words, I'm using my own life as a source of ethnographic knowledge. I will, in what follows, analyze these experiences intersectionally, interdisciplinarily, and decolonially. So next slide. In terms of interdisciplinarity, that involves the combination of two or more academic disciplines into one activity. For instance, a research project. It draws knowledge from several fields. They may be anything. It is about creating something new by thinking across boundaries. So I'm also doing interdisciplinary work since I'm operating at the crossroads of the social sciences and the humanities, being, as Jack Halberstam has called it, a scavenger theorist and methodologist. So this part of my presentation looks at how instances of not belonging took shape for me in the institution of the university that is overwhelmingly wide, both in terms of curricular content and also in terms of who is teaching, researching, managing here. It is masculine, middle class, and infused by heterosexuality. I have often felt as a space invader, someone who in all of these respects, as a Black lesbian, embodies the opposite, maybe except for class. I've done an EU research project in 2008, together with Cassandra Hilaire-Beduc, in which we calculated, mostly by snowball method, that of the circa 20% female professors in the Dutch Academy, hardly a handful of these were female professors of color, which also included Eastern and Southern European women. Things have not improved much since 2008, especially since I think we all know, or should know at least, that faculty of color do not have very high retention rates. In any case, I was the second Black female professor in the Netherlands. Before me, Professor Aida Beatriz Paalman de Miranda, also of Surinamese origin, professor of pure mathematics at University of Amsterdam, was appointed in 1980, taking 30 years between her appointment and mine. At that rate, it's questionable which will come first, the destruction of the planet or the social justice that is necessary to make the university an inclusive site. One is not unrelated to the other. Anyway, note that in the research project I just mentioned, I'm doing intersectionality. In this case, I'm looking at gender and race ethnicity. I'm practicing, can I have the next slide? I'm practicing a way of thinking that simultaneously takes some important grammars of difference into account. By this I mean that we are all positioned differently by major axes of signification: gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, and others that may be pertinent. Imagine that we are all carrying a backpack. It's an imaginary backpack with those positionings in them. That backpack determines to a large extent how we are seen by the outside world, which characteristics and which values are ascribed to us, and which chances we will get in life. Intersectionality is an inclusive way of thinking, initiated by feminists of color in different parts of the world and resistance movements also in many different parts of the world. It goes against the grain of dominant thought that usually foregrounds one grammar at a time. Disciplines are set up like that too. Something either has to do with class or with gender or with sexuality, not with all three at the same time, as intersectionalist practice. Let me show you briefly what happens if you do not practice intersectionality. In 2017, Dr. Jet Bussemaker, the penultimate Minister of Education, pledged money for 100 female professors at the occasion of the celebration of the first female professor, Johanna Westerdijk, at Utrecht University 100 years ago. If one only takes gender into account and you don't pay attention to race, ethnicity, age, then the appointees will be like 98% white women, which is what actually turned out to be the case. Not practicing intersectionality, in other words, repeats and cements existing power relationships. So it is deeply necessary to practice intersectionality. Okay, let me give you a brief mosaic about the time when I was a student in anthropology at the University of Amsterdam in the beginning of the 70s. Once in my second year, we had to write a book review for a class on methods and techniques. The book was Intercultural Communication by psychologist Paul Watzlawick. I simply loved it. It was so engrossing. A book, finally, that dealt with something real to me, that took ethnic and cultural differences in Western societies into account. I really spent a good amount of time on it, and I was pleased with the result. Mind you, this is 50 years ago. I recall the episode vividly. My teachers gave me back my paper without a grade. After class, I had to come into office hours, and they wanted to know, did you really write the paper yourself? Of course, I said. Finally, they believed me and gave me an A+. At the time, still invested in white innocence myself, convinced that there was an equal playing field, I felt flattered and thought that they were impressed with my writing. But later I came to see the situation differently. They actually couldn't believe that I, a young black woman, had written the paper. They thought that someone else had written it or that I had plagiarized someone. In this example, by the way, I'm also invoking decoloniality. I am referring to a consciousness that should become ubiquitous, a consciousness that is aware that modernity is coloniality and vice versa. That is to say, racial hierarchization is part and parcel of modernity. Thus, the images that preceded me in the eyes of my teachers were part of the cultural archive, and apparently these images told them that I would not be very smart, that my Dutch language use would probably be deficient. In any case, that I would not be capable of writing an excellent book review. In terms of belonging, and in hindsight, I have to conclude that even in an institution where supposedly the best and brightest minds linger, exclusion on the basis of race and gender is embedded in the way we do things. These ways may change over time, but then we have to be aware of what we're doing. We have to face what the different obstacles are. Then, as now, the overriding idea seems to be, since we, that is middle-class white people, have a deep-seated conviction that racism, if it takes place at all, is located in working-class circles, we cannot possibly be racist ourselves. Also, the definition of racism is important. If you see it as limited to people with extreme right convictions and extreme right utterances, or if you see it as conditioned by racist intentions, you also can let yourself off the hook and soothe yourself into thinking that we are not racist. The next episode I want to briefly mention is it took me until 1987, when I went to do my PhD at UCLA, to have a black female professor for the first time in my life. This was Professor Claudia Mitchell-Kernan, also an anthropologist, who was also my boss and my supervisor on my dissertation. When I met her and sat in her classes, I realized for the first time I can become a professor too. The importance of seeing someone in front of you who looks like you, who embodies your ideals, cannot be overestimated. One of the privileges of whiteness is that you routinely see professors in front of you who look like you. You're not even aware of it, although most of them will be men. Not so for students of color. Please also know that I had to go to the US to do my PhD, which I found no punishment whatsoever. But I couldn't find anybody in the Netherlands, any professors that would teach me what I wanted to learn, that is to say about race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. So what all these examples show you is that belonging for a person of color is made rather difficult, if not impossible, when the canonical writers, the implicit subject who is being addressed, the teachers in your discipline, are all white. Okay, I am going to try to finish this up, but my last point addresses some of the experiences that I have had since I became a professor in Utrecht. So what strikes me when I come into an academic situation where people do not know me, that my colleagues, but also service personnel, rather frequently address me in English. I apparently have to be American. Apparently they cannot reconcile that a Dutch female professor could be anything other than white. To be one of us ultimately means to be white. One of the most pernicious consequences of race not being acknowledged as a presence in the Netherlands was that I never managed during my years as a professor to get research funding for my projects. While I had been highly successful in getting such funds in or from the US. For instance, I have been a Fulbright. It is only recently that NWO, the Dutch research organization, has started to see the light that proposals centering race are legitimate and worthwhile. This has been costly to me, as one of the criteria which have become increasingly important over the years in the neoliberal university is how much external funding do you bring in? Can I have the next slide? I want to end this part by talking about W.E.B. Du Bois, the first black US sociologist who in 1903 already wrote about the concept of double consciousness. The next one. Double consciousness is still applicable to my own situation and to that of other people of color. I have to know the general, read white bodies of knowledge in the disciplines that I'm affiliated with, while I also have, in order to survive, been wanting to know about the situations of people of color, theories by people of color. And this asymmetry that many white people don't have to do this double move is still absolutely in place. I think that I hope you don't feel that I'm a victim or that I feel that I'm a victim. Far from it. On the contrary, I think I occupy a privileged epistemic positioning that is a position of knowing from multiple disenfranchised sides, and I wouldn't change it for anything. The next one, I'm coming to my conclusions. I have addressed the following: an unproblematic feeling of belonging in the academy, which supposedly represents the best, unbiased, and objective knowledge that can be produced, is not a given for everyone. The combination of one's gendered, racialized, ethnicized, classed, and sexualized positionings play important roles in realizing or not realizing the feeling of belonging. What is at stake, that's my second point, in mapping belonging, as well as in all other knowledge projects, is the necessary realization that our knowledge bases are siloed. That is to say that particular knowers and knowledges, that is white, masculine, heterosexual, are more valued and hierarchized, while this positioning poses as natural, simply producing universal knowledge from a position of nowhere and everywhere at the same time. If we want to realize an academic institution that is equally hospitable and welcoming to everyone, we have to accept our common humanity and dismantle our cultural archive. We have to put an immediate end to the hierarchizing of the silos. Next slide, please. How to map belonging. I have tried to make clear that there are some signposts along the way. It is important to look at belonging interdisciplinarily, kaleidoscopically, aware of existing power relationships, intersectionally, decolonially, and to consistently be asking who the implicit subject of belonging is. What to map? Next one, please. There are 3 different levels of belonging that, for instance, Yuval Davis talks about. And I think it's important to look at additional analytical models and approaches that have been collected by others. We need to pay special attention and develop awareness for forms of non-belonging, how that is accomplished, and how the different groups who experience non-belonging see their own situation and talk back. With whom are we going to do this mapping? The next slide. I have said more often, also in the work that I did as the chair of the Diversity Commission at the University of Amsterdam in 2015-2016, that diversity is a precondition for excellence. Diversity, both in terms of people, with all kinds of different characteristics, and in terms of bringing together different approaches, epistemologies, knowledges, and perspectives. I will finally end with Audre Lorde, next slide, and her words, which have been sustaining me in this journey that I have been on in the course of my life. If I use my words in the service of my vision, then it doesn't matter whether I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. That is a beautiful way to end this wonderful, wonderful and inspiring keynote. Thank you very much. I invite you, Gloria, to take a seat on this beautiful pink chair. And I think it's good to immediately go to Jan Willem's response, because I'm sure you have lots to say about this keynote.
I hope so.
And I hope so too. Yes.
That's going. Let me start by thanking Gloria Wekker for this rich, important and insightful keynote speech that really is the perfect opening lecture for this conference, wonderfully fitting with NIAS ambitions to map out the field of belonging. The lecture shows how special, how exceptional the scholarship of Gloria Wekker is, produced in a hostile environment where being a black lesbian professor was unimaginable. Her scholarship is exceptional as it has developed at the crossroads, the intersection of marginalized people as well as marginalized knowledge in terms of race, gender and sexuality. Her scholarship is unique, exceptional, also because her analysis, her autobiography, shows that for truly understanding one's life, we need sociological categories. We are perceived in terms of groups, even if we want to resist this. We can't make sense of our own lives and the lives of others if we are not aware of structures of exclusion and inclusion. We are born into a world where boundaries have already been drawn, defining who has the right to belong and who does not, resulting in deeply unequal and unfair differences in life chances. Let me use this opportunity to reflect on two topics that came to the fore in Gloria Wekker's lecture, dealing with the topics of belonging and race. First, what does it mean if a country does not love people of color? How to understand anti-black racism in various countries? Is the racism the same or does it differ? This is obviously not only an important scholarly question, but it's also urgent and relevant when we think about ways to fight racism. And second, I would like to reflect on relationships between citizens and nation-states in terms of love, in terms of deep emotional attachments. Since Gloria Wekker shows that countries do love some citizens more than others, the question arises whether we should aim for love for all. Should love as an emotion even be involved in the relation between the nation and citizens? In other words, should we love our country and should we expect the country to love us back? But let's start with the first question. What does it mean when a country does not love people of color? Does this mean the same in various contexts? Gloria argues, and now I quote you, start of quote, "I'm not arguing that the racial contract, the written and unwritten rules of how whites should interact with blacks, in the US looks exactly like that in the Netherlands. But I am arguing that formerly imperial states have formed the cultural archive, which assign superiority and the right to dominate others to whites and inferiority to blacks." End of quote. I'm intrigued by the question how anti-black racism in the US and Europe compares, in Gloria's lecture and in the literature at large. Her presentation shows that the situation for African Americans is perhaps slightly better in academia, at least compared to the Netherlands. The following quote in her paper illustrates how white colleagues assume that a black professor probably comes from the US, and certainly not from the Netherlands. I quote again, "Another aspect of being a black professor in the Netherlands is that oftentimes when I went to academic gatherings where people didn't know me yet, my colleagues, but also service personnel, would address me in English. I had to be American." End of quote. Not end of quote, almost. Apparently, they could not reconcile that a Dutch professor could be anything other than white. End of quote. I wonder how, given the stark racial divides and ongoing discrimination against Afro-Americans, this would have been different in the context of the US. is the combination of being black, lesbian, and a professor more normal in the US than it is in the Netherlands? And if so, I'm curious to better understand these differences. What is the difference in the type or degree of racism that occurs when persons of color in the US can more easily be perceived as a professor, while in the Netherlands this is still seen as a very unlikely scenario? As it is often mentioned in the literature, the relation of black people in the US to the nation is different compared to black people in Europe. First, in the US, they are Afro-Americans. Their Americanness is not, or at least less questioned, than the Europeanness of people of color in Europe. It is said that this is basically because black people have been in the US for centuries, while the mass immigration of people of color into Europe started more recently, after decolonization. In the Netherlands, people of color and the white left-wing elite are often considered as non-Dutch, as non-natives. In the Netherlands, this development is most clearly illustrated, but certainly not limited, to the electoral successes of Forum voor Democratie, which became the largest party in the 2019 Senate elections. In the 2015 radio debate, its leader Baudet stated, I quote him, "I don't want Europe to become Africanized. I'm not demonizing Africans. I'm just saying what I see as desirable and undesirable. What I find undesirable is that more and more we are looking like other parts of the world. I want Europe to remain dominant, white, and culturally as it is." This is a different situation perhaps in the US. There is in the US clearly anti-black racism, but is this racism as much focused on who is native to the country or not as it is the obsession in Europe? Are African Americans perceived as less American than white Americans? Are they seen as an internal minority threatening the self-image of the nation? American sociologist Mary Waters claims that American racism has become less nativist towards Afro-Americans. She observes increased nativism, in the sense of we were here first, as a response to new immigrants arriving from mostly Central and Latin America. It seems as if, on the one hand in the US, Afro-Americans are accepted as part of the national identity, but discriminated against as an inferior category of Americans, but of Americans. It seems as if their belonging to the country is not questioned as much as in the case of Afro-Dutch citizens, who are considered to be mostly incompatible with the Dutch identity. It's true. Trump, if we discuss him, Obama's Americanness was questioned and distrusted by Trump, by conservative media and many American citizens when he was elected as the first black president. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Gloria. Is American racism indeed somewhat less nativist than in Europe? That African Americans are not considered to be totally out of place, while many people of color experience that on a daily basis in the Netherlands, in France, in Denmark, in Italy, and so on and so forth. If, like in Europe, racism is deeply nativist, it becomes even harder for people of color to belong to these countries. Moreover, this would force the anti-racist fight in a specific direction. Black activists in Europe have to claim their Dutchness or Frenchness or whateverness and prove all the time that they belong or aspire to belong to the nation. In other words, they have to show that they love their country. This brings me to my second point. Should citizens expect love from their country? And do they need to love the country back? I admire the fact that you have written White Innocence, the book, I quote, as an act of love towards the Netherlands. End of quote. But at the same time, I wonder if that isn't too much of a deep emotion, love, to connect to your homeland. We know that there is a long and bloody history of nations that expect citizens' love, and there is an amazing long and bloody history of citizens deeply loving their country and paying with their lives. I believe it would actually serve the sense of belonging of Afro-Dutch if white people in the Netherlands would be less loved by their country and would love their country less deeply in return. And perhaps you should also not ask the country to return your love, like you perhaps should not love the country too much. Not just because it may hurt and disappoint, but because it is risky as well. Overly emotional relations between states and citizens eventually produce exclusion. The more emotionally connected citizens and the nation-state are, the more homogeneity is assumed and produced. If we really claim that we want to belong to the nation, to feel at home, the home will be less tolerant for those we don't feel at home with. I would like to invite us to think about the type of emotions that are vested in the relationship to a nation, and the response we expect from the nation-state. Many politicians tell us that we need to feel at home in the city or in the nations. University boards recently tell us that everybody should belong in academia. But is belonging not too much asked for if we want to value pluralism? Sure, everybody should, of course, be welcomed, valued, respected. There should be a place for all of us. But for diversity to flourish, belonging has to know its limitations. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Gloria.
Yes, I promised a performance by Bob Schons after Jan Willem's response, but I think it would be good, and if you agree, that you respond immediately to Jan Willem.
Yes, all right, okay. Well, this is a lot, Jan Willem. Thank you for the response. I see different kinds of reactions that you brought to the fore, and of a different nature also. And it was quite a lot to take in, I must say. So I feel kind of put at a disadvantage because I haven't read your response. I think one of your I thought your response was thoughtful to center what is the kind of relationship that we should envision as beneficial between a nation and its citizens. That there should not be too much emotion involved there. I personally don't really see many problems with, let's say, loving a country. I also don't see that it needs to be exclusive, that you only love one country, because I love multiple countries and I feel a sense of belonging. At the same time, that I also feel in many situations that I do not belong, as I've tried to bring to the fore. So to me, I see the dangers. The danger of what you call nativism in these extreme right parties, but that discourse has traveled along the spectrum. I thought it was really good that you also mentioned how surreptitiously Rutte's words in his last campaigns where he makes clear exclusionary statements towards people, towards parts of the population that he doesn't outright name by their ethnic positioning, but it is entirely clear who he's speaking of when he says to young people that they have to fight themselves in, when he says to people who are critical of Zwarte Piet that, basically get lost if you are critical of the normal Dutch people, when he means to say white people. But my problem here is really that I don't quite see what the concept of nativism brings us, and to what problem does it address itself? What is it able to make us think that racism doesn't allow us to think? So that is really one of my basic and very pressing questions. What does it deliver? What does it help to think nativism? It is not that I want all academic thought to have some immediate applied purpose, but I do wonder, is nativism meant solely to refer to a particular domain, the domain of culture and nation? Isn't there a danger that nativism might be seen as racism light, whereas for me it is outright racism? So I don't really see yet how nativism, what purpose it serves and what it does for us to use and develop this concept. But I would just briefly, I like the question about, are there, I cannot answer this huge question about the differences in racism between the United States and the Netherlands. I only know that when I go to the States, the reception of my work is so totally different than here in the Netherlands. It is much easier to talk about it. People understand what I'm talking about. Here, oftentimes, people are still flabbergasted and don't want to hear it and cannot take it. And why am I so hateful towards the Netherlands? And I must hate the Netherlands and all white people. That is the stuff that it brings up here. I never get that in the States because they have had decades and decades of talking about race. There is a discourse to talk about race, which is, to me, one of the main differences, that people can talk about it without getting totally bent out of shape. The last question I wanted to address is the one about, is it easier to be a black lesbian professor in the States? For sure.
I think I already noticed that Jan Willem was writing frantically about your remark on racism and nativism. So I'm sure he wants to react to or respond to that. But I suggest that first Bab Schons reads a poem for us. If I'm correct, she is in the building. She is about to arrive, and that gives us all some time to think about both Gloria and Jan Willem's response. So, Babs, welcome.
Thank you.
And I won't speak any longer. Go for it.
Well, when a country doesn't love you back, when it doesn't welcome you, and when you are being told to go back to your own country. Go back to your own country. Greet yourself at the border, welcome yourself on your own soil. Your country, where the dust of the earth, the heat of the asphalt, the noise of life come together in your midriff. Go back to your own country. Set foot on your own land, deep within yourself. Lay your hand on your capital city and breathe into your suburbs, where the streets are named after your true heroes. Go back and be your own country. Know your own country. Always just behind your eyes, tucked away just below your chest, between your thumb and index finger. Never be a foreigner, because all of this is your own country. I'm going back to my own country. Set foot on my own lands, full of tales of ancestors, where the spilled blood brought forth deep-rooted oaks that hold me upright among the remnants of plantations. Overgrown, let us all go back to our own country. Make the land belong to everyone again. Let everything that has been trampled on grow back towards the sun. Let us purify the air with camphor and coconut and lemon, burn sandalwood and sage, and listen to the legends and learn to hear the silence again. Under the sequoia, the baobab, link the voices of those who went before us with the soil, the sky, and the rivers. Come back to your own country. Greet yourself at the border, welcome yourself on your own lands, and always keep your country in hand's reach. Somewhere just behind your eyes, in the roof of your mouth, even amidst bleak concrete, let your feet dance softly on the earth. Make sure there are always enough herbs growing in you, enough sand under your fingernails, that the magic of the wind can always find you, and that you never forget the language. Let the land speak to you. Don't ever forget that all this is your own country. Know your own country. Always just behind your eyes, tucked away just below your chest, between your thumb and your index finger. Never be a foreigner, because all of this is your own country. And since language is quite my thing, and I think it's very important to feel welcome in a language. When do you belong in a language? How do the words make you belong? A language that reflects on itself, where new times grow new words, and words that hurt unnecessarily or lost their expressiveness, their power, will lose their place in our dictionaries. How do I want my language? When do I feel welcome? I want my language with room for interpretation, a language in which you don't always know whether you are listening to a love poem or a lullaby or the comforting words of someone close to your heart. A language in which a word exists for an unexpected loving gesture from a stranger, with 100 words for hospitality. A language like a hotel, an inn, words that welcome you after a long journey and make you share your meal without thinking. A language without a norm to exclude, that doesn't other and they, in which we recognize the danger and harmfulness of certain words. A language full of attention, in which we can learn to pronounce just as well Dostoevsky, de Beauvoir, and Tchaikovsky as Fatima Abuluwafa and Zoe Papaikonomo and LGBT without giggling. A language in which you just ask how people want it. He, she, they, them, just like we learned prepositions: above, across, against, near, on, with, and within. A language in which you don't have to come out of the closet, because this language does not have doors, just windows to look out on an ever-changing landscape. A language that says, come, sit, be. A language without borders, where everyone can set foot on the soil with use of their own tongue. With every accent meaning someone is home in more than one language. A language as a museum of the living, told by everyone who is part of history. A language that doesn't exclude people with a single word, but listens to those who have been around for long. A language with space and silence and forgiveness of gestures, and sometimes just not saying something, and sometimes saying nothing, of arms and eyes, of sky and earth, of distance and bones, that say more than. A language as a request, a prayer, a call for humanity, a language that says, come, talk, tell, be silent in your own words. Thank you.
Thank you, Babs. Beautiful. That immediately brings me to a question about language. You just said, just before Babs read her poem, that it took decades and decades in the US to develop a discourse on race. How does it make you feel that we might have to wait decades and decades in the Netherlands to discourse or to develop a proper way to talk about race, let alone race and belonging?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have come to see the struggle that we are in as a marathon. It's not a sprint. So I know it's going to take a long time. I said that they have been talking for decades and decades about race. I think it is significant that so many countries in Europe have managed to convince themselves that race doesn't really play a part in Europe, that it's a problem of the United States and South Africa and wherever, but not here. Whereas race is a concept that originated in Europe and was exported to the United States. So it is only now that we have come to a juncture that race is put squarely on the table, and that all kinds of social movements are rising up to protest against this racial contract that we are under. And it is highly hopeful to me that during this past summer, during Black Lives Matter, so many white people also came, young white people who protested against the death, the murder of George Floyd and everything that is attached to that, and also what is happening in the Netherlands with black people and in other parts of Europe. So it is incumbent upon us to also look at the things that are slowly and on a small scale changing, but I'm very aware that this is not something that I'm going to experience when, you know, we will live in a society that is radically egalitarian.
I am curious now because I know that Jan Willem wants to respond to your racism, nativism. I believe so.
Sure.
And I was trying to compose I can't figure out my mind, so I'll just...
Yeah, well, the things are related, at least the refusal in the Netherlands to take race, and particularly racism, seriously. I think one of the reasons is because it is immediately linked to the question whether it's Dutch or un-Dutch. And we, the Dutch, are not racist. So if you say we are racist, then actually you are un-Dutch. You don't know us because we are not racist. And that shows how nativist it is. It's in the Netherlands, race immediately gets connected to the question, is it Dutch? Like in France. The French are colorblind. It's impossible for the French to be racist. And I totally agree with you that we should not unnecessarily develop new concepts, but I'm deeply convinced that it is important to analyze why the situation and in which ways the situation might be different in the US, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes, so I'm not going to romanticize the US in a negative way, but there are clear differences. In the US, so the point just made by the poet, the question or the slogan, you go back to your own country, Black Americans won't hear that, right? I mean, that's ridiculous to say against somebody in the US. Whereas that's what people hear here in the Netherlands or in France or in Italy or Denmark. So that shows that the racism here, it is all about racism. But the racism has a special coloring, let's say. Like Islamophobia, by the way, and like populism, so let's think indeed intersectional. So all these terrible things that are happening in the Netherlands, it's all framed in the terms whether or not you are Dutch. So, for instance, Islamophobia is not a criticism of Islam. It's told that Islam is not compatible with Dutchness. So it's immediately about Dutchness again. And the problem is, so that's on the analytical, and as scholars I like that, but it is good to analyze that. But indeed, it has enormous strategic consequences. Because social movements like Black Lives Matter in the Netherlands are all the time asked, indeed, whether they love the country. So it is highly culturalized in the Netherlands. It's barely about socio-economic discrimination of black people. It's barely about segregation in neighborhoods. It's all the time about how they feel about the nation, how loyal they are. So they are forced to frame their demands in a nativist way. And even left-wing parties, when they say something is racist, and they say, yeah, that is un-Dutch. But again, it's racism, therefore it's wrong. It's not wrong because it is un-Dutch. So my idea is that the moment we acknowledge how nativist racism is, we can better fight racism.
Okay,
I'll let you think about this for a bit, because I want to include some questions from the audience. First of all, many congratulations. Praise for your wonderful keynote. I think there's one person Carizo, who is saying he's recognizing the example of being addressed in a different language as a person of color. And he asks, Gloria, what is your advice on how to overcome the situation where you are being addressed not in your native language because you're not white, and how to leave a message to the person who starts such a conversation?
Well, what I have always done is I answer in Dutch. And
how do people react?
They're kind of taken aback, and I don't have to analyze at that moment what is happening and what the underlying assumptions are, but they are startled when I answer back in Dutch. So I am hoping that some kind of message will come across in a next situation, that they will act differently, and that
they'll think twice.
That it is possible to be a person of color and to be in the academy, that it will bring that about. So there are many variations on this situation where the assumptions of people come to the fore, which are always painful. When people don't have a check on the cultural archive, let's say, it comes out bursting, like they will assume that I'm the lady who takes care of the coats, or that I'm the one who will give them coffee. So then I have to set them straight too. And I hope that there will be, you know, some kind of development going on.
We should hope so, yeah. Then I have another question, which I'm quite interested in what you respond to. Sedef Osge says, and this really comes back to Jan Willem's remark or response about love and countries as well. Sedef asks, can belonging exist without love? Is belonging just a matter of paperwork and legal justice? Maybe each of you has an answer to this.
Shall I go?
Sure.
I think love is a very important part of it. I cannot, when you grow up here, I've grown up here since I was 1. So this is the country I know, and for a long time growing up here, I was totally part and on board with this exceptionality, and we don't do race here, until I lived for a while in the US, and there I started to see the light. Not everything is as fine and dandy as it is given us to think it is. And I'm aware of what Jan Willem just said about this discourse being forced as a person of color to confess your love before you can be critical. I'm very aware of that because that happens all the time in interviews too, that I first have to, show and prove that I'm a bona fide person, that I may come somewhat closer to the category of Dutch if I confess that I love the Netherlands. And there is this double layer there because I do love the Netherlands, but at the same time, of course, I have to be very critical of it. And I reserve the right to have both of those positions. I do not want love to be the condition that you have to fulfill in order to be critical. But I happen to love the Netherlands too.
Jan Willem?
I think that's really an interesting question, and I'm not too much into definitions. But I do think indeed that, you basically need that all citizens of the country feel that they belong, right? So indeed, I don't think they need necessarily to love the country. That is perhaps for some too much. And even though I like what Gloria said, of course, very much, that she can be loving towards various countries, most people who are really patriotic and have this deep sentiment.
Only
one country.
Yeah.
So the Emeritus is not for the most people. Is not
not
a given.
everyone.
Let's say. But belonging, belonging light is something I think we should indeed take seriously. Because I was not saying that emotions should not play a role in the relation between citizens and the state, the nation state. It should. The contract we have is not just a cognitive one, a rational one. Some emotions should play a role because we need solidarity among citizens. And people only pay their taxes, for instance, for other people to sustain the welfare state when they have some positive feelings about their co-citizens and about the state. So yes, a certain level of belonging, a certain degree of belonging, I think that's what we need. But it shouldn't be... We shouldn't ask too much for people. We don't need that. And it makes living together, I think, even more difficult.
Yeah, so that reminds me also of your speech. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned cultural values in order to belong. If you have common cultural values, and that could be love in a country, or love for a country, that is an aspect of having a sense of belonging.
Yeah, I was mentioning it in the context of when I mentioned Naira Davis, who pays attention to that, to cultural values. At the same time, I don't know that you can ever write that down or make it, a requirement. I agree with that, for people to love this country. It would help an incredible lot if politicians wouldn't utter such negative statements about people of color. That would already make people feel that they belong, that there is a possibility to make a life here. Who knows that they will start to love the country? That cannot be the aim of everything. But I think for those who are here, who are part of the society, those politicians better get used to it, because we ain't going anywhere. So it is smarter to find a way for us to live together with less animosity, and to not stoke that fire. That would be a value that I could subscribe to.
I can imagine. I'm gonna ask one last question, because we are slowly but surely running out of time. Dominique Kandeler, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, asks, what does it mean to love a country whose borders are imaginary geographies in our day-to-day lives? And if the opposite of love is hate, then how do feelings of hate shape who doesn't belong in the nation? A long silence.
No, because it is actually somewhat summarizing, I think, what we said.
Yeah.
That I think, I assume actually the reason why Gloria has as a title, right? Love is in the title. So I had to do something with it, because I thought, well, that is really interesting. And it was not like an apology that you had to make before you had the right to speak. It was really about, I don't understand why this country doesn't love me. But actually, I read it as, I'm so fed up with this country not loving or hating me, right? So it is out of being angry, I can imagine, given what you described, that you say, what is the emotional state between me and the nation? And as you describe, it is so difficult to love those who don't love you back, right? In the long run, that is, of course, not equal. So I think that the question is very well framed. It would have been a very negative evening if we would have spoken the language of hate, though, for evening. But implicitly, we spoke a lot about hate, of course. It is about keeping people out the country, and it is telling people who are in the country, color of people, that they rather should go out, right? So this is a very sad topic, and therefore, I think that nativist racism is so dangerous, because it is really about telling people that they don't belong in this country. So, that's of course the Minder Marokkanen, right? The slogan by one of the far-right leaders clearly shows that eventually their conclusion cannot be any other than that they want people to leave the country. And that is so dangerous that I totally agree that, well, perhaps we should speak even more open about how hateful that speech actually is.
Some final words, Gloria?
Well, what it brought up to me, part of that question was the opposite of love is hate, but somebody like Eli Wiesel says the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. And we haven't even started to talk about indifference, which is also part of the problem, that if indifference, turning your gaze from what is happening in this country among ourselves, if we don't get into action and we don't speak about those things that are unacceptable, that also doesn't help at all. We should all feel that this is something that we are in together, and so that is why I thought the presence of so many different people at the Black Lives Matter demonstrations was so valuable, because this was what it is about. This is something that regards all of us and that we shouldn't be indifferent about.
Thanks. I think I have to wrap up. Thank you very much. I remember when we spoke before this meeting, you said, I'm going to be very explicit and I'm not going to shy away, but I think especially when we talk about love or indifference, that is only a good thing, because then if you're explicit, there's no way to be indifferent. I suggest it is. I mean, it's been an hour and a half, and there's much more to say and to discuss. So I think we have to have a follow-up session somewhere in the near future. But for now, I want to thank both of you and Bob Schons enormously for your contributions tonight. I found it incredibly inspiring, and I also thought that bringing some personal experiences to the table made it very tangible. You used some terms that not all people outside of academics are used to, but I think this makes it. It gave them a grasp on how to think about belonging and race. So closing the session. Tomorrow we are continuing with the conference, both during the day with different panels and arts presentations, and tomorrow we have another keynote by Amin Ghaziani, who will speak about the emplacement of belonging, and especially focusing on LGBTQ+ communities. And Friday, we also have a keynote lecture closing the conference by Nadim Rouhana, who will speak about homeland and the right to belong, focusing specifically on the Israel-Palestine situation. Thank you all for watching. Thanks again, Gloria. Thanks, Jan-Willem. Thanks, Babs. I hope to see most of you tomorrow at the keynotes and the conference. And for now, let's close the session.
Thanks.
Thank you.